Good day. In this I'm going to present you with the 5 most common scenarios that interviewers use to read candidates during job interviews. And the first one I'd like to talk about here would be to spot on whether a candidate prepared a job interview or not. And the most common way they'd achieve this would be with a trick question. Okay, so trick questions still exist even in today's interviews. And the most common example would be, tell me about the time when you failed. And what happens here is that if you have not prepared a job interview, chances are you will either block, either start bluffing, or give a suboptimal interview answer, right? So what's the fix here? Well, luckily, there's only a handful of these trick questions in these job interviews, and these are highly predictable. So long you know them in advance, you'll be pretty much good to go. The other scenario here related to these trick questions would be applying pressure on interview candidates. So they would basically ask you any interview question to which they would follow up with some challenge questions afterwards. And those challenge questions will put a lot of pressure on a candidate, and that will be quite revealing for most candidates, right? So people are a lot easier to read when you put them in a stressful situation. So what can you do about this? Well, luckily, these follow-up and challenge questions are quite easy to predict these days. There's even a STAR Worksheet that will present most of them. So long you read that list and try to bake those follow-up and challenge questions within your stories, you'll be in a far better spot when interviewing. The second scenario I'd like to talk about here, another very common interviewing technique would be what I call the open up technique. So basically the interviewer would ask you a question, you would like answering a question that's enjoyable to answer, something on the lines of what makes you smile these days. And most candidates would get on a personal note with something on the lines, my family, my kids, and stuff like this. And what happens is most candidates, by speaking on a personal level, they would open up. Right? And then the interviewer would follow up with a slightly uncomfortable question, something on the lines of, hey, have you had any shortcomings as of recently? And if a candidate is caught off guard, they would spill the beans with stories that will not play to your advantage, or at least they will not sell yourself as the better candidate during these job interviews. For example, I recently coached a candidate whom I asked, have you had any shortcomings as of recently? And they started giving me 3 failure stories, how they failed 2 major goals and their manager wasn't really happy with them, so they had to move on to another company. Right? So if you think this was a fresher, it was not. It was actually a principal AI scientist with a well-known FANG business. Right? So the fix here would be to always stay cautiously optimistic. And in the same way, there's no such thing as a perfect job. There's no such thing as a perfect candidate either. So it's a balancing act that you'll have to do in these job interviews. Okay. The third technique that interviewers use to read candidates in job interviews is based on the length of your interview answers. Okay. You've probably heard the advice, keep it short, get to the point, or you've probably heard the advice that some people do not ramble in these job interviews. In my experience, if you keep your answers to 30 seconds, you could easily come across as a superficial candidate, right? Of course, if you go on the 5 minutes or the 10 minutes, you could also come across as rambling. But the problem is that if you template all your answers into a given format, 30 seconds, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, and the likes, you will never play to your full potential in these job interviews, and you'll be a lot easier to read or to misread during these job interviews. So the fix here would be to learn to think on your feet during job interviews, because the ideal length of your answer is the one that you decide based on your ability to communicate. If you're a storyteller, you might want to go on the longer side. If you're a technical person, you might get to the point, so to speak. And if your interviewer enjoys what you're saying, you might also want to go on the longer side, right, to play to your advantage. Okay? But so long you stay on your feet, that will be the best formula for success here, right? The fourth scenario, and this is probably the most common way that interviewers read candidates, would be through your introductory statement. You tell me about yourself. And believe it or not, there's candidates who do monumental mistakes here. Specifically, AI rewarded answers. Okay, so you prepare your AI rewarded answer, you're super happy with it, it's just that you never role play it. You never speak it out loud except for that interview. And when you do it, you realize that, it's not coming across to your advantage. Or another very common example is for candidates, when asked, tell me about yourself, to literally perform a readout of their CVs. And if you think these are freshers, no, it actually recently happened to me with a principal PM at Microsoft. Okay, so these are some basic mistakes that are quite revealing for your interviewer in your job interviews with respect to how good you are with these things and how qualified you are ultimately for them to take a risk and advance you to the process, right? And the fifth scenario, probably a more advanced one, would be conflict questions. So candidates are quite easy to read using conflict questions, at least some candidates. For example, I recently had a candidate with 20 years of experience to whom, when I asked them, tell me about a major conflict you had with your manager, they answered, then I never had any conflicts with my manager. I'm a very likable person, and to my 20 plus years of career, I never had any conflicts. Okay, so to an interviewer, this will immediately tell them that you've never been part of high-performing environments. Okay, so it's another scenario when people don't have conflicts is when you've been working all your life remotely. That's another scenario that, hey, you might not do as well in an on-site, in a live setting, right? So this would be the conflict scenario. So these are my 5 scenarios. I hope you found this useful, and thank you very much for watching.